Daniel had become invisible. Not literally, of course, but in the way that people who work in the background often become. For 12 years, he'd followed his mother through the hallways of the Westfield mansion, a sprawling estate on the edge of town where old money lived and breathed in every corner. His mother, Rosa, was the head housekeeper. She'd worked there since Daniel was just 5 years old, back when his father had left them with nothing but unpaid bills and broken promises. The job at the mansion paid enough to keep them fed and housed in the small apartment above the old garage. It wasn't much, but Rosa always said it was honest work, and that mattered more than anything. Daniel had learned early on to make himself small. When the wealthy family had guests, he'd tuck himself into corners with his homework. When they hosted their fancy dinner parties, he'd sit on the stairs leading to the servants' quarters, quiet as a mouse. The residents barely acknowledged him. To them, he was just part of the help, an extension of his mother, nothing worth noticing. But here's the thing about being invisible. You see everything. Daniel watched the way Mrs. Westfield arranged flowers in the grand foyer, choosing each bloom like it was a piece of art. He noticed how Mr. Westfield always checked his reflection in the hallway mirror before answering the door. He saw their daughter Sophie practicing her violin in the sunroom, her face twisted with frustration every time she hit a wrong note. Most importantly, he heard the music. The mansion had a music room. Not just any music room, but one with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the garden, with a crystal chandelier that scattered rainbow light across the walls, and right in the center, a black grand piano that cost more than Rosa made in 5 years. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, a piano teacher named Mr. Hoffman would arrive in his silver sedan. He'd spend an hour teaching Sophie, and Daniel would position himself wherever he could hear. Sometimes that meant cleaning the hallway outside the music room with his mother. Sometimes it meant sitting in the library next door, pretending to read while every word of instruction filtered through the walls. No, Sophie. Your wrist should be loose like water flowing. Don't tense up. Let the music breathe. Count the rhythm in your head. 1, 2, 3, 4. Feel it before you play it. This note here, see? It's not just a key you press. It's a feeling you express. Soft like a whisper. Daniel absorbed every lesson. He memorized every correction, every piece of advice, every technique Mr. Hoffman shared. When Sophie struggled with a difficult passage, playing it over and over, Daniel's fingers would twitch at his sides, mentally working through the problem before she did. At night, back in their cramped apartment, Daniel had a secret. After his mother fell asleep, exhausted from her long days of cooking and cleaning and managing the other staff, he'd pull out a piece of paper he kept hidden under his mattress. It was a keyboard. A piano keyboard he'd drawn himself with a ruler and a pencil, carefully measuring each key to the right size. He'd labeled every note, black keys and white keys, spanning several sheets of paper he'd taped together. It wasn't much. It made no sound, but it was his. He'd place his fingers on those paper keys and practice. His hands would move through scales, through melodies, through entire songs he'd heard Sophie play. His fingers would dance silently across the paper, building muscle memory for an instrument he'd never actually touched. Rosa knew about the paper keyboard. She'd discovered it one morning while changing his sheets. For a long moment, she'd just stood there holding it, staring at her son's careful drawings, the worn spots where his fingers had pressed down thousands of times. When Daniel came home from school that day, she hadn't said anything. She'd just folded it carefully and placed it back under his mattress, her eyes red from crying. They both knew the truth. Piano lessons cost money they didn't have. A real keyboard, even a cheap electronic one, was beyond their reach. Rosa worked hard, but between rent and food and Daniel's school supplies, there was nothing left over for dreams. Especially not dreams as expensive as music. But Daniel couldn't stop. The music had gotten inside him somehow. It wasn't just about the piano anymore. It was about the way certain melodies could make him feel things he didn't have words for. How a simple chord progression could sound like hope or heartbreak. How rhythm could match the beating of his heart. He started borrowing CDs from the library. They had a small collection of classical music that nobody ever checked out. Daniel would take home recordings of famous pianists and listen to them on the old CD player his mother kept in the kitchen. He'd close his eyes and try to picture the fingers on the keys, the way the hands would move, the technique behind each phrase. His favorite was a recording of Chopin's Nocturnes. There was something about the way the pianist played. each note hanging in the air like a question waiting for an answer. Daniel played those CDs so many times that his mother joked she could hear Chopin in her sleep. School was fine. Daniel got decent grades without trying too hard. He had a few friends, though he never invited them over. How could he? Hey, want to come hang out in my apartment above a rich family's garage? It was easier to keep that part of his life separate. His teachers sometimes commented that he seemed distracted, always tapping his fingers on his desk in complex patterns. One teacher even sent a note home saying Daniel might have focus issues. Rosa had just smiled and tucked the note away. She knew exactly what her son was focused on. The years passed like this. Daniel grew taller, his voice deepened, but the routine stayed the same. School, homework in the corners of the mansion, listening to music lessons through walls, practicing on paper keys at night. He'd become an expert at being invisible, at moving through spaces without being noticed. Sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, Daniel would imagine what it would feel like to actually sit at that grand piano in the music room, to feel real keys under his fingers instead of paper, to press down and hear actual notes ring out instead of silence. Would it feel the way he imagined? Would his hands know what to do? He'd never know. That piano wasn't for people like him. It was for people like Sophie, who complained about her lessons and took for granted what Daniel would have given anything to have. That's just how the world worked. Some people were born into music lessons and grand pianos. Others were born into paper keyboards and dreams they could only practice in silence. But then came the night of the annual gala, the one event every year where the Westfield family pulled out all the stops. Caterers, decorators, waiters in pressed uniforms, and of course, entertainment. This year, they'd hired a famous concert pianist to perform for their guests. Daniel had helped his mother all week preparing for the event. They'd polished silver until it gleamed, arranged hundreds of flowers, cleaned every surface until the mansion sparkled like a jewel. The night of the gala, Rosa wore her best uniform and made sure Daniel stayed out of sight in the kitchen. But Daniel had other plans. He'd waited 12 years to see a real concert pianist up close. He wasn't going to miss this chance, even if it meant breaking the rules about staying invisible. He found a spot behind a marble column in the music room where he could watch without being seen. That's when everything changed. That's when the invisible boy decided to step into the light, and nothing would ever be the same again. The music room had never looked more beautiful. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the polished floors. Wealthy guests in expensive suits and elegant dresses held champagne glasses and talked in that particular way rich people do, where every laugh sounds practiced and every word seems chosen for maximum effect. Daniel pressed himself against the marble column, making sure he stayed in the shadows. His mother would kill him if she knew he'd left the kitchen, but he had to see this, a real concert pianist performing just feet away from where he stood. This was as close as he'd ever get to his dream. The crowd began to settle into their seats. Mr. Westfield stood at the front of the room, preparing to introduce the evening's entertainment. That's when he arrived. Victor Chen swept into the room like he owned it. Everything about him screamed expensive, from his perfectly tailored suit to his polished shoes that probably cost more than Rosa's monthly salary. His hair was slicked back and he wore a watch that caught the light with every movement. But it was his expression that Daniel noticed most. A smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The look of someone who knew he was the most important person in the room and wanted everyone else to know it too. The guests applauded as Victor made his way to the piano with slow, deliberate steps. He adjusted the bench, flexed his fingers dramatically, and waited for complete silence before placing his hands on the keys. Then he played. Daniel had expected to be blown away. He'd imagined that hearing a concert pianist in person would be like nothing he'd ever experienced. And technically, Victor was perfect. Every note was precise, every timing exact, every dynamic controlled. His fingers flew across the keys with the kind of speed and accuracy that comes from decades of training. But something was missing. Daniel couldn't quite put his finger on it at first. The notes were all correct, but they felt empty somehow, like reading words on a page without understanding what they meant. The music was impressive, but it wasn't moving. It didn't make Daniel feel anything except impressed. Still, the crowd loved it. They clapped enthusiastically when Victor finished his first piece. Some even stood up. Daniel heard whispers around him about how talented Victor was, how lucky they were to have such a renowned artist performing for them. Victor stood and bowed, soaking in the applause. Then he held up his hand for silence, and Daniel watched as his expression shifted into something that made his stomach turn. "Thank you, thank you," Victor said, his voice carrying that same artificial quality as his smile. "You know, I've performed in concert halls around the world. Carnegie Hall, the Royal Albert Hall, Sydney Opera House. But I must say, there's something special about performing for an audience that truly appreciates fine music." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Music, you see, is not for everyone. It requires breeding, proper education, years of expensive instruction. You can't just decide to be a musician. It's an art form that separates the cultured from the common, the refined from the, well, let's just say from those who wouldn't know a Steinway from a toy keyboard." The crowd laughed at that, polite, agreeable laughter that made Daniel's jaw clench. He'd heard that kind of talk before, the casual way wealthy people dismissed everyone else. But hearing it about music, his music, the thing he loved more than anything, it felt personal. "I started my training at age 3, Victor continued, clearly enjoying his own speech. "My parents invested hundreds of thousands in my education. Private tutors, master classes, the finest conservatories in Europe. That's what it takes to achieve true excellence. It's not something you can learn from YouTube videos or pick up as a hobby. Real music requires real sacrifice, real privilege, and frankly, real talent that most people simply don't possess." Something in Daniel's chest caught fire. He'd spent years being invisible, staying quiet, accepting his place in the background. But those words, that casual dismissal of everyone who didn't have money or connections or the right last name, it broke something inside him. Before he could think about what he was doing, before his brain could catch up with his body, Daniel stepped out from behind the column. "That's not true." His voice came out stronger than he expected, clear, loud enough that conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. The entire room seemed to freeze, everyone staring at this teenager who'd appeared from nowhere. Daniel saw his mother in the doorway to the kitchen, her face going pale with horror. He saw Mr. Westfield's expression shift from confusion to anger. He saw Sophie's eyes go wide with recognition. But he couldn't stop now. The words kept coming. Music doesn't belong to rich people. It belongs to everyone who feels it, everyone who loves it. You don't need breeding or expensive schools. You just need to care enough to learn. Victor turned slowly, like a predator that had just spotted prey. His smile grew wider, but there was nothing friendly about it. "Oh," he said, drawing out the word. "And who exactly are you?" "I'm nobody," Daniel said, and he meant it. "Just someone who loves music." "Nobody," Victor repeated, savoring the word. How wonderfully honest. He looked at the crowd, making sure everyone was watching. "Tell me, nobody, what do you know about music? Have you studied at Juilliard? Trained under masters? Performed for audiences in Vienna?" "No, sir." "Then perhaps you should leave the musical opinions to those of us who actually know what we're talking about." Victor's voice dripped with condescension. The crowd murmured their agreement. Daniel heard someone whisper, "Isn't that the maid's son?" Rosa had made it to his side now, her hand on his arm, whispering frantically. "Daniel, please stop. We need this job, please." But something had been unlocked in Daniel. All those years of silence, of staying in the background, of practicing on paper keys while other people took real music lessons for granted. It all came pouring out. "I've listened," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've learned. I've practiced. And I believe I could play as well as you just did." The room erupted. Laughter. Genuine laughter, not the polite kind. People turned to their neighbors with disbelief on their faces. Someone said, "This is priceless." Another voice called out, "Someone get this kid out of here." Victor's eyes lit up with cruel delight. He'd found his entertainment for the evening, and it was better than any piano performance. "You think you could play as well as me? You, the maid's son, with no training, no education, no talent." "I didn't say I had no training," Daniel replied. "I said I had no expensive schools. I've trained myself every Tuesday and Thursday for 7 years listening to Sophie's lessons. Every night practicing on a keyboard I drew myself because I couldn't afford a real one." The laughter had stopped now. The room had gone quiet again, but this time it was different. People were actually listening, trying to figure out if this was real or some kind of joke. Victor studied Daniel for a long moment. Then his smile returned, sharper than before. "Well, this is fascinating. Tell you what, boy, I'm feeling generous tonight. Why don't you come up here and show us all what you've learned? He gestured toward the piano with a theatrical flourish. Please entertain these good people with your attempt. Mr. Westfield stepped forward. Now wait just a minute. This is inappropriate. Daniel, you need to leave right now, and Rosa, we'll be discussing this later. But Victor held up his hand. No, I insist. Let the boy play. After all, he claims he can match my performance. We should give him the chance to prove it, don't you think? He looked around the room, playing to the crowd. Or are you all afraid you might actually have to take him seriously? The guests were caught between their desire to see Daniel embarrassed and their curiosity about what would happen. Several called out encouragement, the kind of encouragement you give to a child about to do something foolish. Go ahead, kid. Show us what you've got. This should be good. Rosa's grip on Daniel's arm tightened. Her eyes were filled with tears, with fear for their future, with pride in her son's courage, with terror at what would come next. Daniel, she whispered. We can still walk away. It's okay. Daniel looked at his mother, at her worn hands, her tired eyes, her uniform that marked her as help, as less than. He thought about their apartment above the garage, about his paper keyboard, about all the nights he'd practiced in silence because he couldn't make any sound. Then he looked at Victor, at his expensive suit and cruel smile, at the way he stood there so confident that talent was something you could only buy. I need to do this, Mom. Daniel said softly. I need to know if I've been fooling myself all these years, or if music really can belong to people like us. He stepped forward, walking toward the piano. The crowd parted, creating a pathway. Behind him, he heard his mother's quiet sob. Ahead of him, Victor stood beside the bench, waiting with that triumphant smile. This was it, the moment when everything would change one way or another. Daniel's hands were shaking, but his steps were steady. After 12 years of being invisible, he was about to be seen. The question was, would he wish he'd stayed in the shadows? Daniel's legs felt like they belonged to someone else as he walked toward the piano. Each step echoed in the silent room. The crowd had formed a semicircle around him, their faces a mixture of anticipation and pity. Some looked genuinely curious. Most looked like they were watching a car accident about to happen. He caught glimpses of familiar faces as he passed. Sophie stood near her mother, her expression unreadable. Mr. Hoffman, the piano teacher, had somehow appeared in the crowd, his weathered face showing something that might have been concern or interest. Near the back, he saw his mother, one hand pressed against her mouth, looking like she might be sick. Victor stepped aside with an exaggerated bow, gesturing to the bench like a game show host revealing a prize. Please, maestro, he said, and several people chuckled. Show us what 7 years of eavesdropping can accomplish. Daniel reached the piano. Up close, it was even more beautiful than he'd imagined. The black lacquer surface reflected the chandelier light like a mirror. The white keys seemed to glow. He'd watched people play this instrument hundreds of times, but he'd never been this close, never touched it. His hand reached out almost unconsciously, fingers brushing the smooth wood of the piano's edge. It was cool to the touch, solid, real. For 12 years, this piano had been like a painting in a museum, something to admire from a distance but never experience. Now here he was, about to sit at it, about to try to play it. He lowered himself onto the bench. It was the right height, comfortable, designed for playing. Nothing like the kitchen chair he used at home when he practiced on his paper keyboard. The bench had a slight give to it, padding beneath the leather. Rich people even had comfortable places to sit while they made music. Daniel positioned himself, trying to remember everything he'd observed. Back straight but not stiff, shoulders relaxed, arms at the right angle. He placed his hands over the keys, not touching them yet, just hovering above. They were heavier than paper. That was the first thing he noticed. When his fingers actually made contact with the keys, there was a weight to them, a resistance. His paper keyboard had taught him where to put his fingers, but it hadn't prepared him for this, the physical reality of an actual instrument. The room was so quiet he could hear his own breathing. Someone coughed. Victor shifted his weight, arms crossed, waiting for the disaster to unfold. Daniel closed his eyes. If he was going to embarrass himself, if this was going to be the worst moment of his life, at least he wouldn't have to watch everyone's faces while it happened. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he thought about all those Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. Mr. Hoffman's patient voice explaining technique. The key is not to force it. Let your arm's weight do the work. The motion comes from your shoulder, through your elbow into your wrist. and finally into your fingers. He thought about the Chopin recordings he'd worn out. Listening to them so many times he could hear them perfectly in his head. He thought about his mother working double shifts so he could have a warm place to sleep and food on the table. He thought about his paper keyboard, about how many nights he'd practiced until his fingers cramped. Then, he pressed down. The first note sang out into the silence, clear, pure, a single note that hung in the air like a question. Daniel's heart jumped. He'd made that sound. His finger on that key had created something real, not imagined. Not silent, real music. The second note came easier. Then a third. He'd chosen Debussy's Clair de Lune, the same piece Sophie had practiced over and over last month. He knew it by heart. He'd played it 1,000 times on paper, but this wasn't paper. This was complicated. The keys fought back in ways he hadn't expected. Some of them needed more pressure than others. The timing felt different when you were actually producing sound instead of just moving your fingers silently. His first few phrases wavered, uncertain, like someone learning to walk on ice. Someone in the crowd giggled. Daniel heard Victor make a sound, something between a sigh and a laugh. Well, this is painful to watch. The words should have stopped him, should have made him stand up, apologize, run out of the room, but something strange was happening. His fingers were starting to remember, not just where to go, but how to move. The muscle memory from 7 years of paper practice was connecting with the reality of the piano. The melody began to strengthen. His left hand found the bass notes, providing foundation, while his right hand carried the tune. The opening of Clair de Lune started to emerge, hesitant at first but growing more confident with each measure. Daniel kept his eyes closed, shutting out everything except the music. In his mind he could hear the recording he loved so much, the way the pianist had made each phrase breathe, the way the notes flowed into each other like water. He tried to capture that feeling, to channel it through his fingers into the keys. The room had gone quiet again. The giggles had stopped. He reached the main theme, the part where the melody opens up like a flower blooming. His right hand climbed up the keyboard, each note precise. His left hand provided gentle accompaniment, rocking back and forth with the rhythm. This was the part Sophie always struggled with, the part where Mr. Hoffman would stop her and say, "Feel the romance in it. Play it like you're describing moonlight on water." Daniel tried to feel that. Moonlight on water. He thought about the lake in the public park where his mother sometimes took him on Sunday afternoons. The way the light would dance across the surface, constantly moving but somehow peaceful at the same time. He tried to put that into the music. His hands moved with growing assurance across the keys. The weight that had felt so strange at first now made sense. You could use it to create dynamics, to make some notes sing out while others whispered. The resistance of the keys meant you could press harder for emphasis or barely touch them for the softest passages. The middle section approached, where the piece becomes more complex, where both hands play intricate patterns that weave together. Daniel had practiced this part on paper more than any other because it was so beautiful, because it challenged him, because when he finally got it right in his mind, it felt like solving a puzzle. His fingers danced. That's what it felt like anyway, dancing across the keys, finding the right notes not just from memory but from some instinct he didn't know he possessed. The music swelled, building to the emotional peak of the piece. He could feel sweat on his forehead. His breathing had synchronized with the rhythm of the piece. Every muscle in his arms and hands was working together in a way he'd only imagined before. This was harder than practicing on paper, so much harder, but it was also more right. This was what music was supposed to feel like. Not silent, not imaginary. Real. The piece began its descent back to the opening theme, the melody returning softer now, more reflective. Like moonlight fading as dawn approaches, Daniel's fingers grew gentler on the keys, coaxing out the quiet notes that ended the piece. The final measures came, soft chords, each one fading into the next, getting quieter and quieter until they were barely there at all. Daniel played the last note, holding it until the sound dissolved into silence, his foot on the sustain pedal letting it ring out like the last star fading from the morning sky. Then nothing, just the echo of the note dying away. Just silence. Daniel kept his eyes closed. His hands remained on the keys, trembling slightly. He was afraid to open his eyes, afraid to see their faces. What if he'd fooled himself? What if it had sounded terrible, and he'd been too caught up in the feeling of finally playing a real piano to notice? What if his 7 years of practice on paper had taught him nothing except illusion? The silence stretched on. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then from somewhere behind him, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was his mother. Daniel would have known the sound of her applause anywhere. She was clapping hard, fierce, loud, not caring what anyone thought. Her clapping filled the room, defiant and proud. For a moment she was alone. Just one person applauding in a room full of silence. Then another pair of hands joined in. Then another. Then a dozen more. The applause built slowly, hesitantly at first, but growing stronger. Some people were clapping politely, the kind of obligatory applause you give when social pressure demands it. But others were clapping for real, with genuine appreciation, with surprise in their faces. Daniel finally opened his eyes. He turned on the bench to look at the crowd. Their expressions were different now. The pity was gone. The amusement had faded. In its place was something he'd never seen directed at him before. Respect, not from everyone. Some still looked uncomfortable, like they'd witnessed something that shouldn't have happened. Mr. Westfield's face was red, though Daniel couldn't tell if it was from anger or something else. Mrs. Westfield had her hand over her heart, looking genuinely moved. But there was one person who definitely wasn't clapping. Victor stood rigid. His arms still crossed, his face a mask of cold fury. The smile was completely gone now. His jaw was clenched so tight Daniel could see the muscles working. This man, this famous concert pianist, had just been upstaged by a 17-year-old kid with no formal training, no conservatory education, no expensive lessons. And judging by the look in Victor's eyes, he was not going to let that stand. The applause finally died down, fading into an uncomfortable silence that felt even louder. Daniel remained seated at the piano bench, his hands still resting on the keys. His heart was pounding so hard he thought everyone in the room must be able to hear it. Victor took a step forward, his expensive shoes clicking sharply against the polished floor. The sound cut through the quiet like a knife. "Well," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made Daniel's stomach twist. That was certainly something. The way he said something made it clear it wasn't a compliment. "Lucky," Victor continued, walking in a slow circle around the piano, like a lawyer approaching a witness. "You memorized one piece from hearing it repeatedly. That doesn't make you a pianist. It makes you a trained parrot. Any talented mimic could do the same thing with enough exposure." Daniel felt heat rising to his face. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat. Maybe Victor was right. Maybe all he'd done was copy what he'd heard Sophie play. Maybe there was nothing special about it at all. "A real pianist," Victor said, addressing the crowd now rather than Daniel, "doesn't just reproduce sounds. They understand theory. They read music. They can interpret a piece they've never heard before. They have technique refined over decades of proper instruction." He turned back to Daniel, his eyes cold. "You have none of that. What you just did was impressive for a child's trick, nothing more." "I don't think that's fair," a voice said from the crowd. Everyone turned. It was Mr. Hoffman, the piano teacher. He stepped forward, his gray hair catching the chandelier light. "I've been teaching piano for 32 years. What that young man just did was not a trick." Victor's expression tightened. "Oh, and you are?" "James Hoffman. I teach Sophie." He nodded toward the Westfield daughter. "I've been sitting in the next room every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 7 years, and apparently, so has he." He gestured toward Daniel. The technique he just demonstrated, the musicality, the interpretation, that can't be learned by simple mimicry. He's absorbed the principles of playing, not just the notes. "He's self-taught," Victor shot back. "No credentials, no formal education." "You're telling me you think he has real talent?" "I'm telling you," Mr. Hoffman said quietly, "that I've never seen anything quite like it. And I've taught hundreds of students, including some who went on to professional careers." The room buzzed with conversation. People were divided now. Some agreed with Victor, insisting that real music required real training. Others seemed genuinely impressed by what they'd witnessed. Daniel heard snippets of debate floating around him. "It's disrespectful to real musicians, but you have to admit, it was beautiful. His mother should have kept him in the kitchen. Did you see the way his hands moved? That's not something you can fake." Rosa had made her way to Daniel's side. She put her hand on his shoulder and he could feel it shaking. "Come on," she whispered. "Let's go before this gets worse." But before they could move, Mr. Westfield cleared his throat loudly. The room fell silent. The master of the house was about to speak, and everyone knew that whatever he said next would be important. "This is highly irregular," Mr. Westfield began, tugging at his collar. He looked uncomfortable, caught between maintaining decorum and acknowledging what everyone had just witnessed. "Daniel, what you did was inappropriate. You disrupted a private event. You contradicted a renowned guest. He trailed off, looking at his wife. Mrs. Westfield was staring at Daniel with an expression that was hard to read. Finally, she spoke. "It was extraordinary," she said softly. "Charles, it was extraordinary." Her husband blinked. "Margaret, I've heard Sophie practice that piece for weeks," Mrs. Westfield continued. "She plays it correctly, technically perfect, because Mr. Hoffman is an excellent teacher. But what Daniel just played, there was something more in it. Something I've never heard from Sophie." Sophie, standing nearby, didn't look offended. Instead, she nodded slowly. "She's right, Dad. He played it better than I do. Better than I probably ever will. Because he feels it," Mr. Hoffman added. "That's the difference. Technique can be taught, but real musicality, that connection to the music, that's something else entirely. Either you have it or you don't. This young man has it." Victor made a disgusted sound. "This is ridiculous. You're all being taken in by a novelty act. Give me any reasonably coordinated person. Let them listen to something enough times and they could reproduce it on a basic level. Then why don't you teach someone to do it?" The voice came from the back of the room. An older woman Daniel didn't recognize stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Park. I'm on the board of the City Conservatory of Music." She looked directly at Victor. "I've heard you play many times, Mr. Chen. You're technically proficient. But I have to say what I just heard from this young man moved me in ways your performance tonight did not." Victor's face flushed red. "You can't be serious, and I'm very serious," Dr. Park replied. "Raw talent like this is rare. What's even rarer is someone with the dedication to develop it under such impossible circumstances." She turned to Daniel. "How old are you?" 17, Daniel managed to say. His voice came out rough, and he had to clear his throat. "And you've really taught yourself everything just by listening?" "Yes, ma'am. And I read library books about music theory, and I practice on a keyboard I drew on paper." The room went completely silent at that. Even Victor seemed momentarily stunned. "A paper keyboard," Dr. Park repeated. "For how many years?" 7, since I was 10. She shook her head slowly, and Daniel saw what might have been tears in her eyes. That's dedication beyond anything I've seen in my 40 years in music education." Mr. Westfield was looking at Daniel differently now. The anger had faded from his face, replaced by something that might have been calculation. Daniel recognized that look. It was the expression Mr. Westfield wore when he was working through a business problem, weighing costs and benefits. "Daniel," Mr. Westfield said slowly, "you and your mother, my study. Tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. Rosa's grip on Daniel's shoulder tightened. "Mr. Westfield, please, we need this job." Daniel made a mistake, but "We'll discuss it tomorrow," Mr. Westfield cut her off, but his tone wasn't harsh. 2 o'clock. Victor stepped forward one more time. "Charles, surely you're not considering—" "I'm considering," Mr. Westfield interrupted, "that something unusual has happened here tonight. Something that requires thought and discussion. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think this evening has provided enough excitement." He turned to address his guests. "Perhaps we should move to the dining room for dinner." The crowd began to disperse, breaking into small groups as they filed out of the music room. Some cast glances back at Daniel, whispering to each other. Victor stormed out without another word, his face still red with anger. Dr. Park paused as she passed Daniel and handed him a business card. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly, "call me. The conservatory has scholarship programs for exceptional cases." Then she was gone, leaving Daniel and his mother alone in the music room, except for Sophie and Mr. Hoffman. Sophie approached slowly. She'd never really talked to Daniel before, not in all the years he'd been in the house. "That was incredible," she said. "I had no idea you were listening to my lessons." "I'm sorry," Daniel said automatically. "I didn't mean to—" "Don't apologize," Sophie interrupted. "You made that piece sound the way it's supposed to sound, the way I wish I could play it." She smiled, and it seemed genuine. "My dad's going to help you. I'm going to make sure of it." Mr. Hoffman nodded. "She's right. What you have is too valuable to waste." He studied Daniel for a moment. "Would you like to learn properly? Not just listening through walls?" Daniel's throat tightened. I don't have money for lessons. I know, Mr. Hoffman said. We'll figure something out. After they left, Rosa finally allowed herself to break down. She pulled Daniel into a tight hug, her body shaking with sobs. What did you do? She whispered. What did we just do? Daniel hugged her back, his own eyes burning with tears. I don't know, Mom, I'm sorry. I just couldn't stay quiet anymore. Shh, she said, pulling back to look at his face. Don't apologize. I've never been more proud of you in my life. I'm just scared. I'm so scared of what comes next. They walked back to their apartment above the garage in silence. The party continued in the mansion below, the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting up through the night air. Daniel lay in bed, unable to sleep, replaying everything in his mind. He'd touched a real piano. He'd played real music. He'd stood up to someone who'd tried to make him feel small. And somehow, impossibly, people had listened. Important people. But Victor's words echoed in his head, too. Trained parrot. Child's trick. Novelty act. What if he was right? What if Daniel had just gotten lucky with one piece? What if he tried to play something else and failed completely? What if tomorrow's meeting resulted in his mother losing her job, losing their home, losing everything because of his pride? Daniel pulled his paper keyboard out from under the mattress. He looked at it in the moonlight coming through the window. 7 years of practice on a drawing. 7 years of dreams that might be about to come true, or might be about to destroy everything. His fingers moved across the paper keys one more time, playing silent melodies while his mind raced with possibilities and fears. Whatever happened tomorrow would change everything. The only question was whether it would change for better or worse. And somewhere in the mansion below, Daniel knew Mr. Westfield was asking himself the same question. Daniel barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces in the crowd. Victor's anger, Dr. Park's tears, his mother's fear. When dawn finally broke through their small window, he felt like he hadn't rested at all. Rosa was already awake, sitting at their tiny kitchen table with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. She'd put on her best dress, the one she usually saved for holidays. Her hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Whatever happens, she said without looking at him, we stay together. If he fires me, we'll figure it out. I'll find another job. Mom, no. She finally looked at him and her eyes were red from crying. You were brave last night. You stood up for something you believe in. I won't let you regret that no matter what it costs us. They spent the morning in silence, both too nervous to eat, too anxious to do anything but watch the clock crawl toward 2. At 1:30 they walked down from their apartment. Rosa had to report to the kitchen anyway, but she moved like she was walking to an execution. At exactly 2 o'clock they stood outside Mr. Westfield's study. Daniel raised his hand to knock, but before he could, the door opened. It wasn't Mr. Westfield, it was Sophie. Come in, she said, smiling. Everyone's waiting, everyone? Daniel's stomach dropped. He'd expected to face Mr. Westfield alone, maybe with his wife, but as he and Rosa entered the study, he found it full of people. Mr. and Mrs. Westfield sat behind the massive desk. Mr. Hoffman stood by the window, and in the leather chairs facing the desk sat Dr. Park from the conservatory, and another woman Daniel didn't recognize. Younger, with kind eyes and a professional suit. Please, sit, Mr. Westfield said, gesturing to 2 empty chairs. His tone was neutral, giving nothing away. Rosa and Daniel sat. Sophie positioned herself near her parents, her presence feeling like support somehow. Mr. Westfield leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Let me start by saying that last night's events were highly inappropriate. Daniel, you disrupted a private function, challenged a paid performer, and created a situation that could have been very embarrassing for this family. Daniel's heart sank. Here it came. The firing. The end of everything. However, Mr. Westfield continued, and that single word made Daniel's head snap up. What you demonstrated was remarkable. My wife was right. What you played was extraordinary, especially given your circumstances. Mrs. Westfield leaned forward. Daniel, I've been thinking about this all night. My family has a lot of money. We've spent thousands on Sophie's education, on her music lessons, on opportunities most people never get. And there's nothing wrong with that. But last night reminded me that we have a responsibility too. Responsibility to recognize talent when we see it, regardless of where it comes from. Dr. Park spoke up. I've spent the morning making calls. I contacted several colleagues, including the Dean of Admissions at the conservatory. We've reviewed scholarship opportunities and I've explained your unique situation. She looked directly at Daniel. I'd like to offer you a full assessment for admission. If you pass, which I believe you will, we have a comprehensive scholarship program that would cover tuition, materials, and even a stipend for living expenses. Daniel couldn't breathe. The words seemed impossible, like a language he didn't quite understand. The assessment would include performance evaluation, music theory, ear training, and sight reading. Dr. Park continued. I won't lie to you. The sight reading might be challenging since you've never formally studied notation. But Mr. Hoffman has volunteered to work with you to prepare. Mr. Hoffman nodded. I'd like to offer you private lessons 3 times a week, free of charge. You clearly have an ear for instruction. Let's see what you can do with direct teaching. Rosa made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sob. I don't understand. Why would you all do this? The younger woman spoke for the first time. My name is Jennifer Marks. I'm a lawyer who specializes in education equity. Mrs. Westfield contacted me this morning. She smiled warmly. What happened last night was news by midnight. Victor Chen's rather dramatic exit. A video someone took on their phone of Daniel's performance. It's already circulating online. People are talking about the Maid's son who taught himself piano. Daniel felt dizzy. There's a video? Several, actually, Jennifer said. And the response has been overwhelmingly positive. People love an underdog story. More importantly, you've shone a light on something that needs addressing. How many other talented kids are out there with no access to music education? How many Daniels are we missing because they can't afford lessons? Mr. Westfield cleared his throat. Here's what I'm proposing. Rosa, you'll continue working here with a significant raise. Your position is secure. More than secure. We value you, and it's time our compensation reflected that. Rosa gasped. Mr. Westfield, he held up his hand. Let me finish. Daniel, you'll have access to our music room for practice. Any time it's not in use for Sophie's lessons, it's yours. Furthermore, we'd like to establish a music education fund in partnership with the conservatory. A fund that provides instruments, lessons, and opportunities for young people who have talent, but not resources. You'd be the first recipient. If you're comfortable with it, you'd also be the spokesperson. Your story could help others. Daniel's vision blurred with tears. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Sophie urged. Please say yes. You have no idea how inspiring it was to watch you last night. I've been taking music for granted my whole life, treating it like homework. You reminded me why it's supposed to matter. Mr. Hoffman stepped forward. I have a confession to make. I've known you were listening for years. I saw you in the hallway, saw the way you moved your fingers while I taught. I should have said something sooner. I should have offered help. I'm sorry I didn't. You knew? Daniel whispered. I'm a teacher. I recognize hunger for learning when I see it. Mr. Hoffman's voice was gentle. You have something special, Daniel. Not just talent, but the discipline and passion to develop it under impossible conditions. That's rarer than any natural ability. Let us help you become what you're meant to be. Rosa was crying openly now. This is too much. We can't accept all this. Yes, you can, Mrs. Westfield said firmly. Consider it an investment. In Daniel, certainly, but also in what his story represents. My husband and I have been talking. We have resources we don't use well. We've been selfish, really, keeping everything within our own circle. It's time to do better. Dr. Park handed Daniel a folder. This contains information about the conservatory assessment, the scholarship program, and the application process. The assessment is in 3 months. That gives you time to work with Mr. Hoffman, to learn the formal skills you're missing. It won't be easy. You'll essentially be compressing years of study into a few months. But if anyone can do it, I believe you can. What about Victor? Daniel asked quietly. He was really angry. Jennifer smiled. Victor Chen withdrew from several upcoming performances, citing personal reasons. Between you and me, the video comparisons between his playing and yours haven't been kind to him. People are calling his style technically perfect, but emotionally empty. His reputation will recover, but he needed to step back for now. Sophie leaned against her father's desk. Plus, Dad had a conversation with him about contracts and professionalism. Right, Dad? Mr. Westfield's expression suggested that conversation hadn't been pleasant. Let's just say Mr. Chen and I reached an understanding about appropriate behavior toward staff and their families. Daniel looked at his mother. She was staring at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Pride, yes, but also amazement, like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. "We can really do this?" she asked. "This is real?" "It's real," Mrs. Westfield assured her. "We'll draw up formal agreements, put everything in writing. This isn't charity, Rosa. This is recognition of value. Your son has value. You have value. It's time that was acknowledged." The next 3 months passed in a blur of activity. Daniel worked with Mr. Hoffman every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The lessons were intense, covering everything from music theory to proper posture to sight reading. What Daniel had learned through observation now had names, rules, structures. It was like discovering the grammar of a language he'd been speaking instinctively. He practiced in the Westfield music room every day after school. The piano that had once seemed untouchable became familiar, its quirks and personalities revealed through hours of use. He learned which keys were slightly sticky, which pedal techniques worked best, how the room's acoustics affected the sound. Sophie often sat in during his practice sessions. Sometimes she'd play duets with him, other times she'd just listen. They became friends, bonded by music and the strangeness of their situation. The video of his performance continued to spread online. News outlets picked up the story. Daniel did a few interviews, uncomfortable with the attention but understanding its importance. If his story could help other kids get access to music education, he could handle being in the spotlight. The fund Mrs. Westfield had mentioned became reality. Donations poured in from people who'd seen the video, who'd been touched by the idea of the paper keyboard, who believed in giving chances to talented kids regardless of their background. Within weeks, they had enough to provide instruments and lessons to 20 students. Within 2 months, 50 Assessment Day arrived cold and clear in early March. Daniel stood outside the conservatory's main building, his mother beside him, both dressed in clothes they'd bought for the occasion with part of Rosa's raise. "You ready?" Rosa asked. Daniel thought about his paper keyboard, now framed and hanging on the wall of their apartment. He thought about 7 years of silent practice, of listening through walls, of dreaming about this moment, while knowing it might never come. "Yeah," he said. "I'm ready." The assessment took 4 hours. He performed 3 pieces, including Claire de Lune and 2 others he'd prepared. He completed written music theory exams, ear training exercises, sight reading tests. The sight reading was tough, just as Dr. Park had warned, but Mr. Hoffman's training helped him push through. When it was over, the panel of judges asked him to wait in the hallway. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. Finally, Dr. Park emerged, her face unreadable. Then she smiled. "Welcome to the conservatory, Daniel." 5 years later, Daniel stood backstage at the Westfield mansion, preparing for his performance at their annual charity gala. But this time he wasn't sneaking glances from behind columns. This time he was the featured performer. The room had been transformed, with rows of seats facing the same piano where he'd made his first attempt. Rosa sat in the front row, wearing an elegant dress, no longer in uniform.